Okay. And so I'm looking at the stream over there. And I'm going to pretend like we've started because it said go live. So with us today, we've got Fred Fishkin. Fred is the producer, the host of Techstination's podcast, and he's also syndicated on many radio stations throughout the country. He's also co-host of the Smart Driving podcast with our friend, Dr. Alain Kornhauser. So Fred, welcome to the program today.
Thanks so much, Ken. Great to be with you.
And, you know, I've known you for a couple of years, and but I've really felt in the last couple of days, I've really gotten to know you and some of the things you've done, the people you've seen, the people you've met, the stories you've told and reported on, and really the lives you've impacted because of those stories. Award-winning investigative journalist turned tech reporter and discoverer of new cool gadgets. But your story really isn't well told. So I'm hoping in the next half hour or so, we can kind of do that. I've pulled up a PowerPoint here. This is talking about our what we're going to be talking about today. And I want to go to our first slide, and I want to go back to the 70s, a time when hair was much longer, the way I feel my hair is right now, because of this pandemic we're in and the shutdown and not being able to get to the barber. But let's go back to the 1970s and go to Korea. Whoops. Oh, there's the Techstination broadcast. I forgot to bring that up. So hopefully that's up there. We should talk to that in a moment before we go to the 1970s. Fred, why don't you tell us a little bit about Techstination and what you do with that site?
Well, the Techstination is a place where people can go to learn about the latest products, whether it's the latest phones, cameras, issues surrounding technology, paying a lot of attention now, of course, to the coronavirus and the technologies that can help people get through it, all kinds of things. If you look at the graphic on the screen, you'll find one about an increase in sales of bidets by a company called Brundell. But a lot of technology that can help people get through, you know, what we're all living through right now. And that's the way it's been. We've been doing it since the early 1990s. It was previously called Bootcamp. Started out doing it when I was at the WCBS Radio in New York, brought it over also to Bloomberg Radio, where I worked in all for about 30 years between the two stations. And for the last decade or more, it's been independently produced and syndicated. Still going, maybe one of the longest, if not the longest, continuous broadcast about consumer tech that's been on radio. And of course, today it's online, and we put full interviews when we do interviews with people, which we do all the time. We put them online so the audience can really get into the nuts and bolts of the different products and hear what they're all about from the companies themselves.
Well, and you said something yesterday that really touched me, and that is you try to be the ears of the consumer.
Right. When we're talking to a company, it's not so much my opinion that's important. It's really giving consumers the information that they need to learn about the product. So when I'm interviewing a product manager or a CEO, perhaps, the idea is that I'm the consumer. Tell me about your product. Tell me why I should buy it. How are you different from the other companies that are out there? And, you know, what's the value in what you're doing? We've talked to companies that have been big successes over the years. I guess we'll talk about some of those later. Yeah. But lots of companies too, just like you, Ken. You talk to companies that are startups that are trying to make a difference, that sometimes have great ideas, and you just want to put the information out there for consumers to learn about them. Some of those companies succeed, some don't. A lot of them don't. But nonetheless, they're interesting. Some of the same people, you know, you wind up talking to them at one company, and then years later, hey, they're over here now, and they're doing something interesting. So it's great. It's great to have a front row seat to all of that, which is, you know, what I've had for all these years.
Well, and we'll talk a little bit about kind of that front row seat and how things have changed. And again, back to the 1970s here. Let's see if I can figure out how to flip the slide. You'd think it would be easy, and it should be. But back to Korea, back in the 70s. And here is a website I found. This was just a couple years ago, but I think you were stationed here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into radio?
Well, I like to say that the seeds were planted under my pillow when I was a kid. I had a transistor radio that my dad gave me, and I would fall asleep every night listening to it. There were some great programs out there back in the 1960s and late 50s that I would listen to. Gene Shepard and so many others, and I would fall asleep listening to it. So then I started imitating the people I would hear on the air and using little tape recorders and things. So I was really a kid when this seed or bug was planted, for better or for worse, I should say. But so I grew up into it, more or less, wanting to do this kind of thing. I was always into news, and I wound up in the armed services, in the Army, and this was a couple of years after high school graduation. And I went in as a journalist, was trained as a journalist in the service. They had a great school in Indianapolis at Fort Benjamin Harrison. I hope it's still there. It was all branches of the service combined. And we would learn from people who were working in the local market there, grizzled newspaper guys and photographers and TV anchors from the Indianapolis market, and some radio people who would come in and teach us. We learned everything from newspaper layout to getting into the dark room with cameras and writing what made a good story. And some of us graduated from there and went on to work at base newspapers. I did that for a while. I was the editor of the Fort Jackson Leader down in South Carolina before winding up in Korea, where I started in radio. And it was just terrific. I mean, it was a great experience. You had to learn everything from, taking transmitter readings to going on the air and doing everything and running the station and developing a rapport with an audience, which is something I think that I hope at least stuck with me over the years, that you felt a closeness, to the audience. A lot of people who work in radio know it's pretty intimate. You're with people while they're at work. You're with people in their homes. You're with them in their cars, and you're talking to individuals, to people as if they're friends. And that's what I've tried to do with the technology reporting too. Take it from the standpoint, hey, I'm telling you about something. This is what I'd want to know about it, and here's what the story is.
So. And we'll have to get on this thread a little bit later, but I'm just thinking of Good Morning Vietnam when you're giving me this description, but we don't want to do a spoiler alert here. But one of the things that I noticed reading that article was there were some pretty famous people who went through there. Casey Kasem, Gary Marshall produced Happy Days. They were your predecessors. And then there's Fred Fishkin.
Yeah, and we continued to air Casey Kasem even when I was there doing the American Top 40 thing, because you would get some of the programming was shipped out to the stations, and you'd get them on record, you'd get them on LPs, and you'd put the program on and run it that way. I did a local morning show there, and I was on in the evening in Seoul, and then working at the station in Tongducheon near the DMZ, and doing a morning program there. I was the morning host, so to speak. And it was a great experience, and really a real learning experience as we went along.
So your voice has been heard in North Korea, I suppose.
I suppose. And from there, when I finished with the service, I went to work in commercial radio. My first job was in New Brunswick, New Jersey at WCTC, a local station that I grew up listening to as a kid.
Oh, that's fun.
Nearby. So
Yeah, and
great.
that, well, and of course, the best thing out of Korea for you probably was you met your spouse there, right?
I did, absolutely, and we're fortunately, knock on wood here, we're still together and still healthy, getting through all this. And we've got 3 great children, half a dozen great grandchildren, not great grandchildren, great in the terms that they're really good, and it's we've been very fortunate.
Well, and we'll fast forward a little bit. I've found this picture of you interviewing someone. The title of this story this is from the CBS local. What was it? 880 WCBS. There's a picture of you interviewing someone, but his backstory is waking up earlier with reporter Fred Fishkin. And one of the things that you impressed upon me yesterday was the hard work you did in those early days to get your job on WCBS, but you were working a couple shifts. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, when I first went to work in commercial radio in New Brunswick, local radio doesn't pay terribly well back then. And then we had a young family, and I would work in the mornings for the Associated Press. They had an audio operation that provided interviews and reports to radio stations all around New Jersey. And I was one of the people who did that, gathering sound, doing interviews and cutting them up, providing what are called actualities to the radio stations, and doing voice reports for those stations as well. So I would do that from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. That was out of Asbury Park, New Jersey.
Did you ever see The Boss? I meant to ask you that question. That was about the same time frame, right? When he was getting big?
About the same time frame, I suppose. But no, he wasn't in the news operation. This was in the old Asbury Park Press building.
Okay.
And so I did that from 8 to 2, and then worked at WCTC in New Brunswick from 3:30 to midnight. So it was a long day, and I would look forward to an occasional day off to have a little bit more time with our daughter. We had one child at the time who was growing up, and it was tough work, but that led to a job as news director at a radio station in Toms River, New Jersey, WOBM. And from there, I wound up as the news director at the first NPR station in New Jersey, WBGO, a terrific all jazz station up in Newark. And I wound up doing a lot of work for NPR, which I just loved, learned so much about using sound in a story from them. Of course, editing was a whole lot different back then. We were using reel-to-reel recorders and using razor blades and splicing tape. And to put sound behind a story, you were going back and forth with the reel-to-reel. And it was a chore. Today, everything is digital, so much faster, so much easier, and I suppose so much better. But it was a skill that you learned, just the value of using background sound. And from there, I was hired as the New Jersey reporter for WCBS and was brought on staff just a year later, and spent a good long time there, mostly as a morning drive reporter there. And it was there that we started doing the tech reports as well. Kind of an interesting story behind that too, I suppose.
Well, I want to talk to you about that for a moment, but I mean, even when you started at WCBS, I mean, the hours that you'd put in were crazy. You said you had to get up at 1 and 2 in the morning or something.
Well, morning drive radio, that's the nature of it. I mean, the biggest audience in radio, I was fortunate to be given that job, because your biggest audience is typically in radio for morning drive, when people are in their cars going to work or getting up in the morning, turning on the radio, wanting to hear what's going on in the world. And as a reporter, every day you'd wake up to having a different assignment, whether it was a tragic fire somewhere that they would send you to, or in the middle of a snowstorm or a hurricane, you'd be out on the scene. If they send me out to a highway to report on the traffic conditions, icy roads and things, you don't get that in California.
Of course not. Yeah.
But if it wasn't bad where I was, they'd say, well, why don't you go out west into the hillier territory where the roads are slipperier? So here I am, on these icy roads telling people, don't drive. The roads are really bad.
Don't do what I do. But in those days too, it was so much different. There was no internet, but you did some really cutting edge investigative reporting, right? I mean, you found some things. That Chromium story you're telling me about was incredible.
Yeah, well, that I was fortunate enough to win the Edward R. Murrow Award for that, a series of reports. I did a lot of series work where you'd have a report airing once or twice a day with new content, a series throughout a week. Sometimes on a big story, you'd have a 2-week long series that would run at a specific time that would play throughout the day. And it was great that the station was doing that, because it really gave you a chance to dig into a story, do a lot of research. And it wasn't a one-person thing. I worked with lots of great writers and producers in putting those together, and the management, and sometimes even attorneys. When we were doing controversial stuff, which this particular story was, it was about chromium contamination in Jersey City, and it would all have to go through an attorney working for CBS, that they would go through it and say, did you do this? Did you do this? Just to make sure that your bases were covered. They weren't stopping you from doing the story.
Right.
They just wanted to make sure that you were doing it right. And
right.
It was a great learning experience, and did a whole bunch of series over the years for WCBS. And that was great. The station still is terrific, by the way.
Yeah, no, well, it's like the biggest station for news and the biggest market in the world, right? I mean, that's a big deal.
Sure.
And so during that time in the 80s, your kids were coming of age, and you mentioned that you were kind of part of this DIY computer movement. You wanted to help them along.
Sure. When the TI-99 4A came on the market, a personal computer for your home, the commercials were, you need this for your house. You need it so your kids can learn, be part of the future. I bought into that wholeheartedly, and bought it, the TI, and then some subsequent computers. Coleco had the Atom computer, cassette tape drives, and so I bought all of those things, and I would tinker with them too. They were great little machines, and I had a great deal of fun playing with them. And eventually that gave way to the personal computers, the IBM personal computer, and then all of the clones that were out there. Wound up putting my own together, having a lot of fun. A lot of people did that, bought motherboards and drives and memory, and had all kinds of fun. Almost in the days before there were hard drives. And when there were hard drives, they were like 10 megabyte hard drives that were pretty expensive.
Right.
That wouldn't hold one photo from a good digital camera today.
Right.
But it was terrific. So I got started doing that. And eventually that led to me doing the tech segment on radio, because I was helping out and tinkering with the computers at WCBS, helping some people in management there with their personal computers when they were having problems with them, and some great people there. News director Harvey Nagler and Bernie Gershon, who was an assistant news director, decided, hey, let's do a feature on this on air. So I started doing that, and the network syndicated it from there, and it's still on the air today as being called Techstination. Back then it was Bootcamp, and today it's Techstination. So, and it has survived. There's still a market. Of course, we've had to evolve. The technology is so different today from what it was. Back then we were talking about what a big deal it was when CD-ROMs first came on the market, and email addresses. And if you were online, it was through AOL or CompuServe. And AOL, I remember it had a big party for the press in New York when they reached 1 million subscribers. That was such a big deal, with Steve Case, hanging out. And it was terrific to have a front row seat to all of that. And I remember even when Netflix started as a DVD on, rental business, and they would have parties in New York for the press too, when they reached milestones, a 1 million subscriber mark. This was before streaming. Mm-hmm. And now I guess they still will send you DVDs, but I don't know anybody who's getting one.
Well, and it's interesting about Netflix, because he had that vision of what he wanted to be, but he didn't necessarily reveal it to begin with, right? But
sure, you're talking about Reed Hastings. Right?
Reed Hastings, yeah, exactly.
Sure.
And on the screen here, we have another one of your backstories from the CBS local, talking about your boot camp. This was from a few years ago.
Yeah, well, they had their big anniversary a couple of years ago, marking, I think, 50 years of all news radio. And they had some of their veterans come back in to tape with them in the studio. That was great fun, and reminiscing with them about some of the stories that I got to cover over the years, and of course, starting up the technology report with them. And they were great about it. They really were, and realized the value of it. And as a beat for a reporter, if you think about it, you want to be covering stories that make a difference. And it's hard to think of a topic or a subject that you could call your own as a beat that has had such a profound impact on our lives every day. I mean, being there when people started getting cell phones and computers and email and the web, when the I'm trying to remember the guy's name, when the World Wide Web was really just getting started. There was somebody who was working in the White House, and I went to do an interview with him in Washington, who was really overseeing this. And what an impact all of that has had on all of us. I mean, kids today have no clue what life could have been like without a phone, without the internet, and
I remember.
What the question would be, what did you do?
Yeah. Well, and especially in times like this where we're shut in, this would have been impossible, right? What we're doing right now.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. The video conferencing has kept people employed. First of all, people being able to work from home. That's number one, and number two, the families connected. I mean, I use it to talk to my children, my grandchildren now, and I'm doing a story time using video conferencing with some of the younger grandchildren.
Nice.
Which is great fun, and it's I don't know what we'd be doing without it.
Well, one thing you did though is you took the Bootcamp name, and when you went to Bloomberg, it was your concept, your name, your tech, your content. And why don't you tell us about moving on to Bloomberg? And I think while you start that, I'll bring up an image.
Sure. Well, they have recruited me for a couple of years, and around the year 2000, I went over to Bloomberg, and they were syndicating the report from there as well. It was of some value to them because I was covering technology and had contacts with a lot of technology companies, would be able to do interviews with people like Steve Jobs. And I had a background talking with Jeff Bezos at Amazon. I remember when he came into the studio at WCBS to do an interview and told me about his idea for selling books online. And I was skeptical. I said, when I buy a book, I like to thumb through it, go to Barnes and Noble or wherever. And so I was a skeptic. And then obviously I was wrong about that. It's wrong to be skeptical, but it turned out to be a story for a while. Every few months, we'd go back and do another story about Amazon. Hey, they're not just selling books anymore. Now they're selling clothing. Can you believe that? Online, you can buy clothing. I was skeptical about that too. Don't you have to try it on?
Yeah.
and then every new category that they got into, was another story. And now it would be a story if you found something you couldn't buy on Amazon.
Yeah, you're right. And the story is not being able to get it right now when you want it, right? I mean, that's been the story lately. Yeah. This was an article I found from 2007 talking about using these to watch video.
Right. Well, I worked with, that was a story I did. I would do interviews with some of the big names and provide the interviews to the print reporters at Bloomberg. And Peter Brennan, one of the great print reporters there, worked with Ian King and lots who covers Intel and many other companies for Bloomberg. And so they have a great cadre of print reporters, and I got to work closely with them. And so Bloomberg would syndicate my radio reports on tech, and the interviews would be used also on the print side. They're very highly respected print reports, and that was terrific.
And so then come around the last big financial crisis or the meltdown, I guess Bloomberg was no more, but
well, Bloomberg certainly still is today.
Yeah,
but
for you, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What happened was a whole group of us who worked in radio, they cut back very severely in radio and some in television too at the time. And I was among a large group of people who were laid off at the time. That was 2009. I had some great friends and a lot of us went through that together. I fortunately still was able to continue on with the syndicated radio report, radio stations that were carrying my daily reports through Bloomberg. I contacted them, and many of them, just about all of them, said, yeah, we'll continue to carry it as long as you can produce it. And distribution through the internet made it easy. It used to be years ago when I was at CBS, when you had a syndicated radio report, you had to buy satellite time for the distribution of it.
Yeah,
and that's how it was distributed. But when you can send reports out as MP3 files to radio stations, really makes it easy to do, and that's what happened. I was able to do it, and many of the same stations are still running it today. Some great stations around the country. I got to visit one of them last fall. I paid a visit to one in Portland, Oregon, KBNP. So they were really nice, and it was great to visit a station that was, had been with me for so long.
Oh, that's fun. And I imagine too, you've seen just how the technology has just allowed you, one person, to do so much more. It probably used to take a team to do what you're doing today.
Sure. Being able to edit audio on a computer is so much faster than, the old days of reel to reel and such, and the distribution. And well, you're great at production, even with video, and that's so much harder. I'm still trying to learn how to work with video well, and a lot to learn there. But we're doing occasional videos as well, putting things up on YouTube, and still a learning curve. But audio, I can churn that out pretty fast.
Well, and then that gets to let's see if I'm sharing this yet. That gets to our friend and how we met, Dr. Kornhauser. And there's the picture of you too. I love this picture of where was that at CES 2019 or 20?
That was at CES in 2019. I had met Alain Kornhauser, who's the faculty chair for autonomous vehicle engineering at Princeton. I met him years ago through his software company, which was called Travroot Software. It was the first time I had seen in-car navigation. He had developed a software that would run. It was too powerful for a smartphone or for a phone at the time, but he had a small notebook computer that he would put up on the dashboard with a GPS receiver attached and up on the dashboard, and it would give you turn-by-turn directions as you were traveling. Just amazing stuff. He was doing this before anybody else was doing it, I think. And it was just really amazing and well done. And so his vision was for us all to have these connected vehicles. And when I would run into traffic problems, my car would tell other cars, the kind of stuff that you see today that's so commonplace.
Just don't say DSRC.
So
Alan's not in the line, or else it'd be his cockles would be raised, or whatever you call it, whatever.
So I met him through that, doing interviews with him over the years when they would come out with new versions, and eventually when he came out with it to run on a smartphone. First, I think a BlackBerry, because that was probably the most powerful handheld device you could buy at the time. But eventually onto Windows phones, and then of course when the iPhone came along. So I met him through that, and we stayed close and friendly over the years. And through that and the connections there, we wound up doing this podcast, the Smart Driving Cars podcast, which has been really terrific. We do it every week. I just finished putting one together.
I can't wait to listen to it.
Just a few minutes ago. And now we're adding some video to that as well. which is why I really have to learn and get sharper with the video editing. Although we don't edit a whole lot, whether it's the audio side or the video side. We do a podcast, and you're hearing pretty much the whole thing. Not a whole lot of editing involved there. And he's so knowledgeable, and he's taught so many people over the years who are working in this field. The guys who are making autonomous vehicles happen, whether it's at Waymo or NVIDIA or many other companies as well. His students are out there doing it, and he's still teaching. I think it's 40 some years that he's been a professor at Princeton. Just amazing.
Yeah, it is incredible. And what I really like about the podcast is you guys are just a great dynamic between you two. You keep them reined in and always are there with that quick wit. Always good for a laugh. And just the chemistry between you two is wonderful. So I really enjoy listening.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, he's terrific to work with, and I wouldn't say reined in. You don't want to
No, I know. I shouldn't say that either. I'm teasing.
I try to maybe steer a little bit what should be self-driving, but that's
exactly. That's ironic. So as long as we're kind of on this celebrity discussion, I'm going to see. Am I sharing? I think I am. These are some pictures you sent earlier in the week, and I think they're appearing on the broadcast here. It looks like that's James Dyson. Is that right? In the upper left-hand corner?
James Dyson, doing an interview with him. That was really a thrill. I mean, people who've really done so much to change things. I mean, a lot of us have the Dyson vacuums today.
Sure.
But now you can't. Now you're drying your hands on a Dyson when you go into a Costco, I think, or lots of other places too. And I think that particular interview might have been the time when they introduced the hand dryers. So that was great fun. And I think there's some other photos there. Maybe.
Yeah, Steve Ballmer, it looks like you're interviewing.
Steve Ballmer, who succeeded Bill Gates at Microsoft, and we talked to Bill Gates many times over the years as well. I think there's one there with Steve Wozniak.
There is right next. Yeah. What were your impressions of Woz?
Woz is terrific. I mean, just a personable guy, down to earth, and just fun and smart. Obviously, really smart. And he had written a book, I think, and he had come into the studio for an interview about that. And next to him there is of course, Steve Jobs. And that was at the opening of one of Apple's stores in New York, I believe. Yeah,
I see that. There's a Genius Bar in the back.
Yeah.
So is this were you still at Bloomberg at that point?
Yes, I was at Bloomberg when I did that interview with him.
And then he wasn't one to speak to the press that often, was he?
He was not. He was so great on stage, a terrific showman. Whenever he would unveil a new product and he was on stage, he knew how to grab an audience and hold them so well. But when it came to talking to the press, he wasn't quite as comfortable doing interviews. It was a matter of, I suppose, him being in control of the discussion so much like he was when he was on stage. And that's true, I suppose, of quite a few CEOs who've been out there. Bill Gates initially, I think, was pretty much the same way, not that comfortable talking with the press. Today, I think, at his foundation with his wife, it's totally different. He seems very relaxed, comfortable in talking to the press about the things that he's working on, the causes that he's working on. And
there's a picture of you in the lower right-hand corner interviewing Bill Gates, it looks like.
Sure. And there's one up above there too, I can see.
Was that Stephen King? Sorry.
Stephen King, right? That was at an Amazon event when he was there to promote, I guess, some of his books on the latest Kindle, talking with him about that. I think there's a photo perhaps of Colin Angle in there somewhere, who's the founder of iRobot.
I think he might be on either the left middle, I think.
Yeah. And Michael Dell is there. And you got to talk to just about everybody. I told you before when we were talking privately, as a street reporter, I got to meet politicians and everyone else,
George Burns, you said.
Oh, George
Right?
Burns, sure.
Yeah.
He came out with a book called How to Live to Be 100. And there was a press event, and I got to do a great fun interview with him. But sometimes some of those fun people would bleed over into technology, because you've got the photo there of Robin Williams.
Good morning, Vietnam, right?
Good morning, Vietnam.
It ties it all back to Korea for you.
It does. But that interview was when he started doing a program on Audible, which is now owned by Amazon. It wasn't at the time. I got a call from their press relations people. Hey, we've got Robin Williams starting a show, and he's doing some interviews. Do you want to come over and chat with him? And what would you say? And it was just terrific. And he did some great ad-libbing. And on the Techstination site, if you go to the bottom of the page, you can listen. He just took off when I told him the name of the program was Bootcamp. Boom, a light goes off in his head. And for the next 2 minutes, he goes off on this great comedy skit about Bootcamp. And
having listened to it yesterday, it was incredible. And it's worth a listen.
And it was so tragic when we lost him, and how we lost him, and that really affected me greatly, because thinking back to that. I interviewed George Carlin too at one point for a tech segment. It was great fun. Getting to talk to all these different people. As a street reporter, I started to say I got to talk to politicians, everybody and anybody who had been running for president, got a chance to meet and talk to. Of course, it was to their advantage. I was working for, a big city radio station, and
sure.
And talking to the candidates at the time. That was part of the job for both of us, but it was still a thrill.
Any that stand out for you in those interviews?
Yeah, they all do in their own way. I mean, Jimmy Carter, I remember seeing him. I think I was probably at WBGO when he was running, and it was really interesting. And that was done in Newark. He was I remember him coming to the Robert Treat Hotel, and nobody had ever heard of Jimmy Carter before, but his smile, which became famous, was right. So infectious. And you could see why he caught on with people.
Okay.
In running for office. Peanut farmer becomes president,
Great American story, right?
And we've seen stranger things since, but it was a great American story, I suppose. But and I remember in chatting when I did an interview with Bill Clinton, the way he would really make you feel like, okay, you have his full undivided attention, his eyes, stared into yours, and it was a great interview.
Interesting.
A great person to interview at the time.
Yeah, but obviously a very smart person. I've heard that before about him. He had that ability to make you feel like you're the only one that mattered at that point, right? Absolutely.
And covering Ronald Reagan when he was running, and so many others, through the years. It was a privilege to have a front row seat. And I always made sure, times were different back then, I suppose, from what they are today, but still, as a reporter, my family did not know how I was going to vote in any election, because I would tell no one what my personal thoughts or feelings were. And my feeling was, and still is, that it's different when you're a commentator, which we have all the commentators out there today,
sure,
on cable and whatnot. But my feeling was that my thoughts and opinions had no place in a story. You tried to tell a balanced story and get both sides of every story as best you could. So in New York, I had many interviews with Senator Al D'Amato, who was a Republican, and fortunate to have interviewed people like Senator Moynihan and successors, and getting to know the first Governor Cuomo and Mayor Koch, covering him almost a couple of times a week, probably, when doing morning drive radio. If it was a slow news morning, he would depart Gracie Mansion and come down the driveway, and there'd be a couple of us reporters there waiting for him on a slow news day. And you could ask him about anything, and he'd he'd make news.
Wow.
He could give his opinion about anything, and he was always delightful to talk to. A smart man.
Well, and you covered some pretty big stories live that would have to be very emotionally impactful, and obviously were. But how did you separate kind of the reporter from the Fred Fishkin and keep those things separate?
Not easy, and I'm not sure that you always should, as a reporter, separate your emotion from a story, because that's a part of the story. I'm not talking about a display of phony emotion that comes across that way, which you might see or hear from time to time. Hopefully not. But the genuine emotion of a story, what we're going through today, reporters covering the coronavirus and having to talk to family members who've lost people and such. The most impactful of all, pretty obviously, was 9/11. I was working for Bloomberg at the time as a street reporter, and they sent me down there the minute the first plane hit one of the towers, when it was thought that it was a small plane going into one of the towers as an accident. And I spent the next few weeks reporting from down there, and was there as the towers came down. And
wow.
Just the memories, the sound, and the looks on the faces of people who, we were all in shock, together, and the emotions afterwards that went on for days and days and days, really, they still haunt you.
Well, and literally, I mean, the story engulfed you, right? I mean, you were right in the middle of the dust and everything, right?
Yeah, I and every other reporter who was in New York that day, I suppose, we were covered in it, literally and figuratively.
And
you were immersed in this.
It's amazing. It was only 19 years ago, but it was you were still using. Well, you weren't using cell phones. You were using pay phones, right?
Well, we had cell phones, but they weren't working when the towers came down. There were two issues. First of all, some of the hardware was, I think, on the Twin Towers for the cell phone signals, and secondly, the other towers. So many people were trying to use their phones to reach family members, coworkers, friends, anyone, that it was jammed. You couldn't get a call through. I was fortunate that I was able to duck into a bookstore near the World Trade Center with a window facing the Trade Center, and they had a payphone on the wall right by the door. And I was able to, I asked the owner, I said, "Do you mind if I use this payphone to go on the air?" And they said, "You can do that, go ahead." And he did that for quite some time, probably an hour and a half. And during that time, the towers came down, and eventually he said, "I have to go, I have to leave, I have to lock up, I'm going back to my family."
Yeah.
It's perfectly understandable. And, but I was able to go on the air from that payphone and describe what I was seeing. It was obviously horrible.
I guess for your family's sake, at least, they had the radio and they knew you're okay, huh?
Yeah, my wife had been a little bit frantic when a daughter had called her up, told her to turn on the TV. Did Dad go to work in New York today? And she said, "Yeah, he did." And then she turned on the TV and saw that. And obviously she was worried. Then my son called her up. He said, "Don't worry, I'm hearing Dad on the radio. Turn the radio on, you can hear him."
Yeah.
So thank goodness for that. And eventually I was able to make a quick call to her and tell her, that I was okay too, using that payphone before I left there. But what a horrible experience. And from there, they sent us over to St. Vincent's Hospital in New York, where all of us reporters wound up penned in an area by the police across the street from the hospital. And all of the emergency room people were out on the sidewalk with gurneys waiting for what was anticipated to be a lot of people to be brought in, the people who were injured. And the nightmarish thing was that those gurneys remained empty.
Wow.
Because there weren't survivors, at least at first. Very few people eventually were brought out, but there was no rush of people being brought in because people didn't survive. People were turned, obviously, to dust, and that was scary. And then over the next days, family members would come to that same area to talk to the reporters who were there, asking, showing pictures of their fiancés, their husbands, wives, loved ones. Have you seen this person? And they were in tears, and there was nothing we could say to them other than, no, we haven't seen people.
Wow.
It was, that kind of story lives with you forever and gives you a different perspective when you come upon the anniversary every year too. It kind of brings everything back. I
bet. I mean, that's, I guess, one of the nice things about reporting with Techstination. It's, you can report on the upbeat, if you will, right?
Yeah, for the most part, everything is pretty much upbeat when you talk about the impact of technology. I mean, there are some bad stories, obviously, out there. There are people who use the technology, the internet, for bad stuff. But for the most part, when you talk about the innovations taking place and being able to cover all of that and the way it's changed all of our lives has been terrific. Front row seat and meeting all the people who are making things happen and thinking about that. And today, doing the Smart Driving Cars podcast, it's really carried over to that, because that's, to me, probably the next big thing. How it's going to change mobility and the way we all get from here to there. Professor Kornhauser likes to use the elevator analogy. Anybody who knows him is laughing right now. But that's the way he sees it, that ride sharing and a new kind of mobility as a service, mobility for all, for people who can't afford a car, that we're going to have this new kind of transportation where you don't have to own a car to get where you want to go. And the impact on the environment and so many other things. It's his vision for it is certainly not that you and I are going to own a car that can drive itself. That's nonsense, in his eyes. You don't need it. I don't need it. But what it can mean to so many people, whether it's people with disabilities, who can't see well, the elderly, so many people who really need transportation and aren't really served by mass transit today in most areas of the country. That's how things change.
Yeah, it's like the internet was 20, 25 years ago, when you could kind of see the inklings of it and everyone knew there'd be a big change. And people, the cynics at the time were saying, yeah, but show me the business case, show me the profit and everything like that. And it wasn't necessarily at that time, but we're on the cusp of something. And it took, some years, but it got there. And I think we're in that, we're in that kind of incubation stage in a lot of ways.
Yeah, the technology is certainly, people say, well, does it really work? Well, it doesn't work the way it's going to work, obviously. You remember when you first got a cell phone, that didn't work so well either. Right. But it's going to work. It gets better, all the time. And there are some really, really smart people and smart companies who are making it happen. And the ones that are really going to make it happen, probably we haven't heard of yet.
Exactly. Well, and I kind of look at the things that, like with what really got broadband going, was cable's adoption of some of the provisioning that made it easier to install this stuff, right? I mean, the technology worked. You could get data over a coax network, but to actually install it and provision it and make it easy for a consumer to sign up for service, that was some of the challenge. And so I look for those kinds of things, simple things like we're seeing, like the windshield or the little washers for the headlights and the radar or the LiDAR or whatever to, clean the self-cleaning, right? So they're thinking of these operational issues, right? You guys talked about the Kornhauser cleaner to disinfect, right?
Sure, because you talk about today with ride sharing, everybody's am I going to get into another car with a whole group of people? Look at, I can't even be within 6 feet of somebody now. But eventually that changes, and eventually you have ways to sanitize vehicles, and that's what he was talking about with that. Because this makes you think about things in different ways. Before it was, not so much disinfecting a vehicle, but are you going to get into a vehicle with a stranger, or are you going
Right.
to put your child in a vehicle with a stranger? There are lots of things, that will change and evolve as we go through this. And as Professor Kornhauser likes to say, people have to learn how to behave.
Exactly. That's a common another common Kornhauserism, I guess. So, Fred, I've really appreciated. I've appreciated sharing rides with you and Alan, by the way. But I've really appreciated this time together, and we'll repeat it one more time. But how can people get a hold of you and watch your great, or listen and watch your great content?
Well, the Techstination is at techstination.com. It's like destination, but with tech in front, TECH Stination. And Smart Driving Cars, the podcast, you can find that at smartdrivingcar.com. We've started a little YouTube channel too, so some of the videos will wind up there. And email is Fishkin, Fishkin, at techstination.com.
Excellent. Well, Fred, I appreciate it. And we'll be back next Friday with a friend of mine, Tom Coughlin, this time talking about resources that the IAAA USA has to help members learn and continue on in this environment. And we might have some other guests talking about those types of resources too. So that'll be next Friday at 1:30 Pacific Daily Time, 4:30 Eastern. So go ahead.
Great work, Ken, and thank you for all that you do. You do a great job with all of this, and we'll see you out there.
Yeah, I will pay you for that comment in a moment. I'm going to end the stream right now, and I'm going to. Yep.